The leather journal felt cold against my palms, even through my gloves. Dust particles danced in the single shaft of light piercing through the boarded window of my grandmother's attic, illuminating the cracked spine of something that hadn't been touched in God knows how long. I shouldn't have been there. The estate lawyer had been clear about which boxes were mine to sort through and which belonged to my cousins. But something about this particular trunk, shoved behind a century-old dresser with deliberate care, called to me like a whisper across time. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a history professor who thought she knew everything about her family's past. My grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood Mitchell, had died 3 weeks prior at the age of 104, taking with her stories she'd promised to tell but never did. When you're older, she'd say, her clouded eyes distant, when the world is ready. But the world ran out of time, and so did she. The journal's first page made my blood run cold. Property of Rose Blackwood, 1924. If found, please destroy immediately. Some truths are too dangerous to survive. I should have listened to that warning. I should have thrown it in the fireplace downstairs and watched a century of secrets turn to ash. Instead, I turned the page, and in doing so, opened a door to America's darkest corridors, where the price of progress was paid in blood, tears, and silenced voices. What I discovered in those pages would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family, my country, and the very ground beneath my feet. This is Rose's story. This is America's story. And by the end, it will be yours too, because the shadows of history are long, and they touch us all, whether we acknowledge them or not. The girl who saw too much. Rose Blackwood had been taught from birth that there were two Americas. There was the America of sunshine and promise, the one printed on postcards and sung about in patriotic hymns. Then there was the America of shadows, the one whispered about behind closed doors, the one that left bodies swinging from trees and dreams buried in unmarked graves. At 17 years old, in the sweltering summer of 1924, Rose was about to discover that these two Americas weren't separate at all. They were the same country, wearing different faces depending on who was looking. She lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, though the city she inhabited bore little resemblance to the thriving metropolis it had been 3 years earlier. The Greenwood District, once known as Black Wall Street, the wealthiest black community in America, was still rebuilding from the massacre of 1921. Rose remembered that night with crystalline clarity, though her mother begged her to forget. She remembered hiding in their cellar while the sky turned orange with fire, while screams cut through the darkness like knives, while her father gripped his rifle with shaking hands and whispered prayers he didn't believe in anymore. They had survived because their skin was white. That simple accident of melanin had been the difference between life and death, between keeping their home and watching it burn. Rose's father, Thomas Blackwood, was a journalist for the Tulsa Tribune, one of the papers that had helped incite the violence with inflammatory editorials. He'd written those words, put his name to lies that led to murder, and the guilt was eating him alive from the inside out. "Promise me something, Rosebud," he'd said to her one night, months after the massacre, his breath heavy with whiskey. "Promise me you'll remember. When they try to erase this from the history books, when they try to pretend it never happened, you remember. You write it down, you tell the truth I was too coward to tell." She'd promised, not understanding the weight of that vow. She'd been 14 then, still believing that truth had power, that words could heal, that justice was more than just a concept rich men used to keep poor ones in line. Now, at 17, she was older. Not wiser, perhaps, but older. And she was about to learn that some truths came with a price too terrible to pay. It started with a boy, as these stories often do. His name was James, though everyone called him Jimmy, and he was the son of Edward Carruthers, the oil baron who owned half of Tulsa and wanted the other half. Jimmy was handsome in that careless way wealthy boys often are, with golden hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that promised adventures his station in life would never require him to actually have. He'd noticed Rose at a church social, been charmed by her quick wit and the way she didn't simper and blush like the other girls when he paid them attention. "You're different," he'd told her, and like a fool she'd believed it was a compliment. They'd been courting for 2 months when Jimmy invited her to his father's estate for a summer party. Rose's mother had been thrilled. The Blackwoods were comfortable, respectable, but they weren't wealthy. An alliance with the Carruthers family could change everything. Her father had been less enthusiastic. "Edward Carruthers is a snake," Thomas had muttered, but he'd given his permission anyway. What choice did he have? You didn't say no to men like Edward Carruthers in 1924 Tulsa. Not if you wanted to keep your job, your reputation, your safety. The party was exactly what Rose expected. Opulent, excessive, loud, with a kind of laughter that comes easy when you've never had to worry about where your next meal is coming from. She'd worn her best dress, pale blue with lace collar, and felt simultaneously overdressed and hopelessly outclassed. The Carruthers estate was a monument to wealth, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers, built on land that had been taken from Creek Nation families who'd been given no choice but to sell. Jimmy had been attentive at first, introducing her to senators and business magnates and their bored, beautiful wives. But as the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed more freely, he drifted away, pulled into conversations about oil drilling and land acquisition and profit margins. Rose had found herself alone, wandering the great house's corridors, looking for a bathroom or a quiet place to breathe or any escape from the suffocating performance of it all. That's when she'd heard the voices coming from Edward Carruthers' study. She should have walked away, should have found Jimmy, made her excuses, gone home. But Rose had her father's curse, curiosity that overrode common sense. She'd pressed herself against the wall beside the partially open door and listened. "The families are becoming a problem," a man's voice said. Rose didn't recognize it, but it carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "They're organizing, talking to lawyers. Some are even demanding compensation for the properties destroyed." "Let them demand," Edward Carruthers replied, his voice smooth as oil and just as slippery. "The courts won't help them. We've made sure of that." "There are journalists asking questions," another voice interjected, nervous and young. "The Negro newspapers are publishing testimonies. The Chicago Defender, the Oklahoma Eagle." "Negro newspapers," Carruthers interrupted with a laugh. "No one who matters reads those rags. And as for white journalists, well, we have ways of ensuring their cooperation. Thomas Blackwood learned that lesson well enough, didn't he?" Rose's heart stopped. Her father. They were talking about her father. "The man writes what we tell him to write now," Carruthers continued. "After we reminded him how quickly a respected journalist can become an unemployed drunk with a family to feed. The Tribune has been very helpful in shaping the narrative. The official story is that the Negroes rioted, that we had no choice but to respond with force, self-defense, maintaining order, protecting white women." "Some people know the truth," the nervous voice pressed. "Some people saw what really happened. The planes dropping firebombs, the machine guns, the executions. What people saw and what they can prove are two different things," Carruthers said coldly. "And what they can prove and what they can get anyone to care about are two different things again. This is America, gentlemen. We're 3 years past it now, and the world has moved on. There will be no investigations, no trials, no justice. We've already won." "What about the mass graves?" the first voice asked. "Eventually someone will dig, someone will find." "Let them dig in 100 years, Carruthers interrupted. "By then, we'll all be dead, and it will be ancient history. This country is very good at forgetting its sins. Give it time, and the Tulsa race massacre will be nothing but a footnote, if that. We'll make sure of it." Rose felt bile rising in her throat. She'd known, of course. Everyone who'd been there knew that the official story was a lie, that the massacre hadn't been a riot but a planned decimation, that innocent people had been murdered while the authorities stood by or participated. But hearing it confirmed so casually, hearing these men laugh about it, about the bodies, the families destroyed, the justice that would never come. Her hand had clutched at her chest, trying to steady her breathing, and in doing so she'd knocked against a decorative table in the hallway. A vase wobbled, didn't fall but made enough noise. The conversation in the study stopped abruptly. "What was that?" the nervous voice asked. Rose ran. She didn't think, didn't plan, just gathered her skirts and fled down the corridor, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Behind her, she heard the study door slam open, heard heavy footsteps, heard Edward Carruthers shouting for his men. She'd made it to the main parlor, desperate and panicked, when Jimmy caught her arm. "Rose, what on earth? You're white as a sheet. What's wrong?" She'd looked at his handsome, concerned face. This boy she'd thought she was falling in love with, and realized she couldn't trust him. Couldn't trust anyone. "I'm not feeling well," she'd managed, her voice shaking. "Please, I need to go home." He'd tried to insist she rest upstairs, that he fetch a doctor, but she'd been insistent. In the end, he'd called for a car to take her home, confused and slightly hurt by her sudden desperation to leave. During the entire drive, Rose had stared out the window, her mind racing. What had she heard? Proof that the massacre had been deliberate, that powerful men had orchestrated it and covered it up, that her own father had been coerced into helping spread their lies. Proof that there were mass graves somewhere in Tulsa, unmarked and unacknowledged, holding people who'd been murdered and then erased from history, but proof that she could never share. Who would she tell? The police were complicit, the newspapers were controlled, the courts had been bought, and she was 17 years old, a girl, powerless in every way that mattered. When she'd arrived home, her father was still awake, sitting in his study with a glass of whiskey, and a look of defeat she'd seen too often lately. "How was the party?" he'd asked, not really caring about the answer. Rose had stood in the doorway, studying this man who'd been her hero once, before the massacre had broken something fundamental inside him. "Papa," she'd said quietly, "Edward Carruthers said you write what he tells you to write now." The glass had slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Whiskey spread across the hardwood like blood. "Rose," his voice cracked. Did you hear?" She'd told him everything, every word, every awful detail. And as she spoke, she watched her father age 10 years in 10 minutes. When she finished, he'd sat in silence for so long she thought he might have stopped breathing. Finally, he'd looked up at her with eyes full of tears. "I'm so sorry," he'd whispered. "I'm so goddamn sorry, Rosebud. I should have been brave, should have told the truth, should have fought, should have been the man I promised your mother I'd be. But they threatened you, threatened your mother, said there'd be an accident, a fire, something I couldn't stop. And I believed them because I'd seen what they were capable of. I'd watched them burn down 35 city blocks. I'd seen them murder babies. So I wrote their lies and I kept my family safe, and I told myself that's what a good father does." Rose had crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. They were shaking, or maybe she was shaking, maybe they both were. "It's not too late," she'd said, though she didn't believe it. "We could tell the truth now. We could." "They'll kill us," he'd interrupted flatly. "The moment we try, they'll kill us all." "That's not cowardice talking, Rosebud. That's realism. Men like Edward Carruthers don't let threats to their power live." "Then what do we do?" Rose had asked, feeling tears finally spill down her cheeks. "Just pretend? Just forget? Just let them get away with it?" Her father had pulled her into his arms, holding her the way he had when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "We remember," he'd said, his voice rough. "We write it down, every detail, every name. We keep a record, and we hide it ere no one will find it until enough time has passed that the truth can't hurt anyone anymore. Maybe 50 years, maybe 100, but we make sure the truth survives, even if we don't." And so Rose had started writing. In the dead of night, by candlelight, she'd filled page after page of a leather journal with everything she knew, everything she'd heard, everything her father could remember about the massacre and its aftermath. She'd written about the Greenwood district before the destruction, about the doctors and lawyers and businessmen who'd built something extraordinary only to watch it burn. She'd written about the children killed, about the women assaulted, about the men executed and dumped in the Arkansas River. She'd written about the mass graves that Edward Carruthers had mentioned so casually, somewhere in Tulsa, holding hundreds of bodies that had been denied even the dignity of burial records. She'd written about the conspiracy of silence, about the newspapers that wouldn't print the truth, about the officials who'd participated or looked the away, about the insurance companies that refused to pay out to black families while paying white ones in full. She'd written about her father's coercion, about the threats that had turned him from truth-teller to propagandist, and she'd written about America, the country that could be simultaneously the land of the free and a place where entire communities could be massacred with impunity, where justice was available only to those who could afford it, where skin color determined whether you were victim or victor. It had taken her 3 months to finish, writing whenever she could steal time alone. By the time she'd filled the last page, it was autumn, and her hand was cramped, and she'd cried so many tears over those pages that some of the ink had run. Her father had helped her hide it, had built a false bottom into an old trunk where they'd placed the journal along with photographs of Greenwood before the massacre, newspaper clippings from the black press, and a letter from Rose explaining everything she knew. Whoever finds this, she'd written in that letter, "I hope enough time has passed that the truth can be told without more bloodshed. I hope you live in an America that's learned to face its sins. I hope you have the courage we didn't have. Remember these people, say their names, give them the justice we couldn't." They'd hidden the trunk in the attic, behind a dresser too heavy for one person to move, and they'd made a pact never to speak of it again. 2 weeks later, Thomas Blackwood died in what the police called an accident. His car had gone off a bridge late at night. They said he'd been drinking, that it was tragic but not suspicious. Rose knew better. Edward Carruthers had found out somehow, or suspected, or simply decided her father was too much of a liability. The how didn't matter. The result was the same. At her father's funeral, Jimmy Carruthers had tried to comfort her, had held her while she sobbed, had promised that his father would make sure she and her mother were taken care of. Rose had accepted his embrace while planning her escape. She couldn't stay in Tulsa, couldn't marry into the family that had murdered her father, couldn't live with these secrets eating her alive. 3 months after the funeral, she'd fled to Boston with what little money she LD gather. She'd told her mother everything before she left, had begged her to come, but her mother had refused. "I'm too tired to run," she'd said, "and they won't hurt an old widow who keeps her mouth shut. But you go, Rosebud, you live, you survive, and maybe someday when enough time has passed you tell this story." Rose never saw her mother again. She built a new life in Boston, changed her name to Eleanor, married a kind man who never asked about her past, and raised a family who knew nothing about Tulsa, about the massacre, about the journal hidden in an attic thousands of miles away. She'd planned to go back eventually, to retrieve the journal, to finally tell the truth. But years became decades, and the risk never seemed worth the reward. Who would believe her? Who would care about something that happened so long ago? The men who'd orchestrated the massacre were dead or dying. The victims were dead. The witnesses were dead. Even the city itself had changed beyond recognition. So she'd kept silent, carrying the weight of those secrets until it bent her spine and clouded her eyes and turned her into the grandmother I'd known, sweet, kind, and haunted by ghosts she couldn't aim. And now she was gone, and I was sitting in that same attic, holding that same journal, reading words written by a 17-year-old girl who'd seen too much and paid the price for trying to tell the truth. Rose's story was my story. The Blackwood family's shame was my inheritance. But unlike Rose, I lived in an age of the internet, of social media, of movements that demanded we say their names and face our history. I lived in a time when silence felt like complicity, when the weight of the past pressed down on the present and demanded accounting. I had choices Rose never had. I had platforms Rose couldn't have dreamed of. I had protection, imperfect, incomplete, but more than she'd had. The question was, what would I do with it? The price of truth. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. After reading the journal, cover to cover, I'd sat in that attic until dawn, surrounded by dust and ghosts and the wreckage of a family secret that had metastasized over a century. My phone had died hours ago, its battery drained from the flashlight I'd been using to read by. The house was silent except for the settling of old wood and the whisper of wind through cracks in the walls. When morning finally came, gray and uncertain through the dirty windows, I climbed down from the attic with the journal clutched against my chest like a shield. Or maybe a weapon. I wasn't sure which it was yet. The estate lawyer was coming at 9 to finalize the last of the paperwork. I had 3 hours to decide what to do. 3 hours to choose between honoring my grandmother's century of silence or breaking a promise she'd made to protect me, my mother, everyone who shared the Blackwood name. I made coffee in my grandmother's kitchen, using her old percolator because I couldn't figure out how to work the modern machine my cousin had bought her years ago and she'd never used. The familiar ritual was comforting, measuring the grounds, filling the water chamber, listening to it bubble and hiss. My grandmother had made coffee this way every morning of her life. Had she thought about Rose while she waited for it to brew? Had she looked at her hands and seen the hands that had written those terrible truths? I pulled out my laptop, opened a new document, and started typing. Not a plan exactly, more like a conversation with myself about what this journal meant, what it proved, what it could do. Rose had documented not just the Tulsa massacre, which, despite decades of suppression, had finally started to get recognized by historians, but the conspiracy to hide it, the mass graves that still hadn't been found, the names of specific men who'd planned and profited from the destruction. She'd recorded conversations that proved premeditation, that showed this wasn't a spontaneous riot but a calculated act of terrorism and economic warfare. More than that, she'd exposed the machinery of American historical erasure, the way newspapers could be controlled, courts could be bought, witnesses could be threatened, and entire atrocities could be wiped from collective memory. The 1921 Tulsa massacre had been largely unknown for decades, excluded from Oklahoma history classes, absent from national textbooks. It wasn't until survivors started speaking out in the late 20th century that the truth began to emerge. Even now, in 2026, many Americans had never heard of it, but they had heard of other things. The summer of 2020 had awakened something in America, a reckoning with racial violence that refused to be silenced. Movements demanding accountability, communities organizing, historians pushing back against sanitized narratives. The country I lived in was different from the one Rose had fled. Not better, necessarily, we still had so far to go, but different. More willing, perhaps, to face uncomfortable truths. Or was that just optimistic thinking? Was I romanticizing his moment, seeing possibility where there was only danger? I thought about my career. I was up for tenure next year at a prestigious university. I'd built a reputation as a careful scholar, someone who dealt in facts and primary sources, who let the evidence speak for itself. Publishing this journal would make me radioactive to some people, would invite scrutiny of my methods, my motives, my objectivity. Descendants of the men Rose named were probably still powerful, still connected. They would lawyer up, would claim the journal was fake, or that Rose was unreliable, or that I was driven by ideology rather than historical truth. I thought about my family, my mother who just lost her grandmother and didn't need the media circus this would create, my aunt and uncle who were already fighting over the estate, my cousins who'd grown up with the same sanitized family history I had, who had no idea about the Blackwood family's complicated legacy. I thought about the victims, the families who'd never gotten justice, never gotten answers, never gotten their stories told, the bodies still buried somewhere in Tulsa, in mass graves that Rose's journal could help locate. The descendants who deserved to know what happened to their ancestors, who deserved the truth that had been denied for 100 years. I thought about Rose. 17 years old, terrified, brave beyond measure, she'd risked everything to write down this truth, had lived her entire life carrying the weight of it, had hidden it so carefully that it had survived a century. She'd addressed her final letter to whoever found it, begging them to have the courage she hadn't had. Was I brave enough? Was anyone? One, now charged, buzzed with a text from my department chair asking how the estate stuff was going, when I'd be back for the fall semester. Normal life, waiting for me to return to it. I could put the journal back in the trunk, hide it again, wait another 20 years or 50 or 100. I could tell myself that the timing wasn't right, that I needed more corroboration, that I had responsibilities I couldn't abandon. I could do what Rose had done and let someone else carry this burden. But I'd spent my entire career studying moments exactly like this one, inflection points where individuals had to choose between comfort and truth, between silence and testimony. I'd written papers about the Pentagon Papers, about Karen Silkwood, about the tobacco industry whistleblowers. I'd taught students that speaking truth to power mattered, that documents like this were precious, that history belonged to everyone, not just the victors. How could I ask students to value historical truth if I hid it when it became inconvenient? I picked up my phone and called Dr. Marcus Washington, a colleague at Howard University who specialized in African American history and historical trauma. We'd collaborated on a project about Reconstruction 2 years earlier. If anyone would understand the weight of what I was holding, it was Marcus. He answered on the third ring, his voice warm and slightly confused. "Sarah, it's 7 in the morning. Please tell me you're not calling to talk about the conference paper revisions." "Marcus, I found something, I said, my voice shaking. I need your help, but I also need to know. If you had evidence of a major historical crime, evidence that could hurt powerful people and put you at risk, but could also give closure to victims' families, what would you do? The warmth left his voice, replaced by sharp attention. What kind of evidence are we talking about? I told him everything. The journal, Rose's testimony, the names, the mass graves. As I talked, I could hear him moving, heard a door close, heard him settling in to really listen. When I finished, there was a long silence. Send me pictures of the pages, he finally said. All of them. I need to verify the handwriting is consistent, check the paper dating, look at the linguistic patterns. If this is real, Sarah. It's real, I interrupted. I know it's real. I believe you, he said gently, but we need to be able to prove it. Because the moment you make this public, you're going to be attacked from every angle. People will question your motives, your methodology, your sanity. You need an ironclad case. So you think I should publish it? Another pause. I think you should think very carefully about what you're willing to sacrifice. Your career, your privacy, your sense of safety. All of that is going to change the moment you step forward with this, and there's no guarantee it will make a difference. We've had survivors testifying about the Tulsa massacre for decades now, and we still haven't gotten reparations, haven't gotten official acknowledgement from the federal government, haven't found all the mass graves. This journal is powerful, but it's not magic. It won't fix everything that's broken. But it's evidence, I pressed. It proves premeditation, conspiracy, cover-up. It could reopen investigations. It could, Marcus agreed. Or it could get buried again by people with more power and resources than you have. I'm not trying to discourage you, Sarah. I'm trying to make sure you go into this with your eyes open. This is going to be the fight of your life. What would you do? I asked again. If it was your family's secret, your grandmother's journal, what would you do? I heard him take a deep breath, let it out slowly. I'd tell the truth, he said quietly, because my ancestors didn't have that choice. Because silence is what let this happen in the first place. Because the only way we break these cycles is by dragging them into the light, no matter how much it hurts. But that's me, and I've spent my whole career fighting these battles. You have to make your own choice. We talked for another hour. He agreed to help me verify the journal's authenticity, to connect me with forensic historians and archivists who could establish provenance. He also warned me to secure the journal somewhere safe, to make copies, to be prepared for legal challenges and public scrutiny. When we finally hung up, it was almost 9. The lawyer would be arriving any minute. I went back up to the attic and photographed every page of the journal, uploading them to a secure cloud storage. Then I wrapped the journal in acid-free paper I found in my grandmother's sewing supplies and placed it in a fireproof safe I discovered in her bedroom closet. The safe also contained other documents, birth certificates, her marriage license, old stock certificates, and a sealed envelope addressed to me in her shaky handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. My dear Sarah, it read. If you're reading this, then you've found Rose's journal, and you're trying to decide what to do with it. I've watched you grow into a woman who values truth, who chose to study history because you believe it matters. That's why I made sure the journal would go to you, not your mother or your aunt. They would hide it again, out of fear or loyalty or simple self-preservation, but you, I think you might be brave enough to finish what Rose started. I won't tell you what to do. This has to be your choice, but I will tell you this. I've carried this secret for 87 years, and it's made me a coward. I could have spoken up 1,000 times. I could have told the truth when the Tulsa survivors started coming forward in the 1990s, could have supported them, could have given them this evidence. But I was afraid of what it would cost, afraid of who it would hurt, afraid of being Rose all over again, young and terrified and powerless. Don't be like me, sweetheart. Don't let fear turn you into someone you don't recognize. Whatever you decide, make sure you can live with it. Make sure when you're my age, looking back on this moment, you're proud of the choice you made. I love you. I'm sorry for burdening you with this. And I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to do it myself. Always, Grandma Eleanor, Rose. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. She'd known. She'd planned this. She'd given me the journal deliberately, had entrusted me with this impossible decision. and she'd apologized for not being brave enough, as if carrying this secret for nearly a century while building a life and raising a family wasn't its own kind of courage. The doorbell rang. The lawyer, right on time. I went downstairs, tucked. He let her into my pocket and opened the door. We spent 2 hours going through paperwork, signing documents, finalizing the transfer of property. The lawyer mentioned that several historical societies had expressed interest in purchasing some of my grandmother's papers and photographs. She'd been a meticulous record keeper, had saved everything. Actually, I heard myself say, I may have some materials that would be of significant historical interest. Can you recommend someone who handles authentication and archival donation? The lawyer looked surprised but pleased. She gave me contact information for several institutions, including the Smithsonian and the Library of Congress. After she left, I sat in my grandmother's living room, my living room now, I supposed, and made a list, not of what I needed to do, but of what I needed to understand. First was the journal genuine. Marcus would help with that, but I needed my own verification. I needed to research Rose Blackwood's life, find other documents in her handwriting, establish that she was real and credible. Second, could the journal's claims be corroborated? Rose had named names, mentioned specific locations for the mass graves. Were there other sources that confirmed any of this? Were there ways to test her information? Third, who would be affected by publication? Not just me and my family, but the descendants of the victims, the descendants of the perpetrators, the city of Tulsa itself. What did I owe to each of these groups? Fourth, what was the best way to tell this story? Academic publication? Journalism? A book? Who was the audience, and what did I want them to do with this information? And finally, most importantly, what would justice look like 100 years later? What could possibly make this right? I spent the next 3 months answering those questions. I worked with Marcus and his team to authenticate the journal. We confirmed the paper dated to the 1920s. We found other examples of Rose Blackwood's handwriting in her high school yearbook, in letters she'd written before fleeing to Boston, in a diary from her teenage years that my grandmother had also saved. The handwriting matched. The linguistic patterns were consistent with someone of her age and education writing in that period. The specific details she mentioned about Tulsa in 1924, street names, businesses, local events, all checked out. We cross-referenced her account with other documentation of the massacre. Survivor testimonies mentioned many of the same details. Commission reports from the 1990s confirmed the use of planes dropping firebombs, the machine gun nests, the systematic destruction. Rose's account aligned with what we knew from other sources, but added new information about the planning and cover-up. Most significantly, I hired ground-penetrating radar specialists to survey the locations Rose had mentioned for the mass graves. We found anomalies consistent with mass burials in 3 different sites. The city of Tulsa, which had been conducting its own investigation into possible grave sites, was interested but cautious. This was explosive information, literally and figuratively. I also started reaching out to descendants of massacre victims. This was the hardest part because I was asking them to relive trauma, to open old wounds, to trust a white woman from a family that had been complicit in the cover-up. Many were skeptical. Some were angry. A few were hopeful. One conversation in particular changed everything. Her name was Vivian Harris, and she was 93 years old, the granddaughter of a Greenwood district doctor who'd been killed in the massacre. We met at a coffee shop in Tulsa where I'd traveled to do research. She'd agreed to talk to me after Marcus vouched for my intentions. She was tiny, elegant, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. "So you're Thomas Blackwood's great-granddaughter," she said, studying me, "the man who wrote those lies about us in the Tribune?" "Yes, ma'am," I said, meeting her gaze. "I'm so sorry for what he did, what my family did." She nodded slowly. "My grandmother talked about your great-great-grandfather sometimes, said he'd been a good man once, before they got to him, said the white men who ran this city broke him, turned him into a tool. She didn't hate him exactly. She pitied him." "That's generous," I said quietly. "Maybe," Vivian allowed. "Or maybe she just understood that we're all trying to survive in a system designed to break some of us and reward others. Your grandfather was broken differently than my grandfather was murdered. But the same evil did both." She leaned forward. "The question is, What are you going to do about it? I told her about the journal, about Rose's testimony, about the evidence of mass graves. As I talked, I watched her face transform. Hope warred with pain, anger danced with something like vindication. All these years, she whispered when I finished, all these years we knew, but we couldn't prove the conspiracy. Couldn't prove it when all the way to the top. That it was planned. They called us liars, said we were exaggerating, said it couldn't have been as bad as we remembered. And now you have proof. I have one person's testimony, I corrected. It's powerful testimony, but it's proof, Vivian interrupted firmly. It's what we've needed. What my grandmother needed to hear before she died. What my mother needed when she was fighting for reparations in the 70s, and everyone laughed at her. What every survivor needed when they testified before that commission and got sympathy but no justice. She reached across the table and took my hands in hers. They were soft, warm, surprisingly strong. You publish this, she said. You tell Rose's story and our stories together. You make people understand that this wasn't ancient history, wasn't some unfortunate incident. This was terrorism. This was genocide. This was America, the same America that enslaved people and destroyed native communities and interned Japanese families and separated children at the border. The same America we're all still living in. I'm afraid, I admitted. Afraid of getting it wrong, afraid of making it worse, afraid of— Good, Vivian said. Fear means you understand the stakes. But don't let it paralyze you. Rose was afraid too, and she wrote it down anyway. Your grandmother was afraid, and she saved it anyway. Now it's your turn. Be afraid and do it anyway. We talked for hours that day. Vivian connected me with other descendants, with community historians, with activists who'd been fighting for Tulsa, massacre recognition and reparations for decades. They welcomed me, cautiously, and helped me understand the contempo. Rare context I needed to understand. This wasn't just about the past. It was about ongoing racial disparities in Tulsa, about land theft that had never been remedied, about intergenerational trauma, about the way that massacre had stunted black wealth accumulation for generations. It was about environmental racism. One of the suspected mass grave sites was now covered by a highway. It was about how Oklahoma schools still barely taught this history, how national textbooks still barely mentioned it. It was about how America had never really reckoned with the violence baked into its foundation, had never really compensated the communities it had destroyed, had never really delivered on the promise of equal justice under law. 6 months after finding the journal, I was ready. I'd written a scholarly article for a top history journal, documenting Rose's testimony and my verification process. I'd also written a more accessible piece for a major newspaper telling the human story. I'd worked with documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell this story visually. I'd connected with the Tulsa city officials investigating the mass graves, offering Rose's information to help their search, and I'd prepared myself for the backlash I knew was coming. It came fast and hard. The academic article was accepted but immediately controversial. Conservative commentators accused me of pushing a divisive narrative, of trying to make white people feel guilty, of weaponizing history for political purposes. Descendants of the men Rose named hired lawyers, threatened defamation suits, claimed the journal was fake despite all the authentication. My university received demands that I be fired, that my tenure case be rejected, that I be investigated for academic misconduct. My social media filled with hate mail, death threats, accusations that I was a race traitor or a virtue signaling liberal or worse. But there was support too. Historians rallied behind the journal's authenticity. Massacre descendants publicly thanked me for helping tell their ancestors' stories. Students organized teach-ins about the massacre. Other universities invited me to speak. And most importantly, the Tulsa investigation moved forward. Using Rose's information combined with other sources, they identified the most likely location for the largest mass grave. They began the careful process of excavation, bringing in forensic anthropologists, preparing for what they might find. I was there the day they found the first bodies. It was a cold morning in November, almost exactly 105 years after the massacre. The excavation site had been cordoned off, but I'd been invited to observe along with massacre descendants and city officials. We stood in silence as the anthropologists carefully, reverently uncovered what had been hidden for over a century. The first skeleton was small, a child, maybe 10 years old. then another adult, then another child, then more and more, laid out in no particular order, buried in a mass grave with no markers, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of their humanity. Around me, people were crying. Vivian Harris stood with her hand over her heart, tears streaming down her face, whispering names of family members who'd never been found. Other descendants held each other, grief and validation warring on their faces. A reporter asked me how I felt. Heart broke. I said, and angry that it took this long. And grateful that Rose wrote it down, that my grandmother saved it, that we finally can give these people the dignity they were denied. The excavation continued for weeks. They found over 200 bodies in that grave alone, and evidence of at least 2 other mass burial sites. Each body was carefully documented, studied, treated with the respect they'd been denied in death. The city committed to identifying as many victims as possible, to notifying their descendants, to creating a proper memorial. The journal became a key piece of evidence in a new push for reparations. Survivors' descendants filed lawsuits citing Rose's testimony as proof of conspiracy and premeditation. The legal battles were ongoing, complicated, with no guarantee of success. But for the first time, the full truth was part of the public record. The massacre couldn't be minimized or dismissed anymore. Rose's words made sure of that. A year after I found the journal, I returned to my grandmother's house, which I'd kept, unable to sell it, for the anniversary of her death. I went up to the attic where this had all started, sat in the same spot where I'd first read Rose's words. I thought about courage and how it comes in different forms. Rose's courage to write the truth, my grandmother's courage to preserve it, my courage to share it, the courage of the massacre survivors who'd testified for decades despite being dismissed and doubted, the courage of their descendants to keep fighting for justice. I thought about America and its long, painful relationship with its own history. How we want to believe in progress, in moral arcs bending toward justice, in the past being safely in the past. But the past isn't past, as Faulkner wrote. It's not even over. The wealth gap between black and white families can be traced back to moments like the Tulsa Massacre, to the destruction of black economic success, to the theft of land and opportunity. The distrust of institutions in black communities can be traced back to moments like these, when the police participated in violence instead of preventing it, when the courts denied justice, when the government failed to protect its citizens. We can't fix any of that without first acknowledging it happened, without naming the perpetrators, without facing the uncomfortable truth that America was built on violence and extraction and systematic oppression, and that we inherited that legacy whether we want it or not. Rose understood that. At 17, she understood that silence was complicity, that forgetting was a choice, that the only way to honor the dead was to tell the truth about how they died. I pulled out my laptop and opened the book manuscript I'd been working on. It was Rose's story, and my grandmother's story, and the story of the Tulsa Massacre. But it was also America's story. The story of how we bury our sins and how they haunt us anyway. The story of how truth can be suppressed but never destroyed. The story of how justice delayed is justice denied, but how it's never too late to try. I typed the dedication for Rose, who was brave when bravery meant risking everything. For Eleanor, who carried the weight so I wouldn't have to. For the victims of the Tulsa Massacre, whose names we're still learning, whose stories deserve to be told, whose lives mattered then and matter now. And for everyone who's ever had to choose between comfort and truth, may we all choose truth. The book would be published the following year. It would spark more controversy, more conversation, more of the painful but necessary work of reckoning with our history. It wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't bring back the dead or undo the damage. But it would add another piece to the historical record, another voice demanding that we remember. Outside my grandmother's attic window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me uncomfortably of fire, but also of beauty, of endings that led to new beginnings, of light persisting even in darkness. I thought Rose would have appreciated that. The girl who'd written by candlelight, who'd risked everything to document truth, who'd hidden her words carefully so they'd survive until someone brave enough could share them. Her diary had been hidden for a century, but its words were timeless, remember. Speak. Resist the comfortable lie. Choose the difficult truth. I closed my laptop and whispered to the empty attic, to the ghosts of Rose and Eleanor and all the people whose stories had been buried too long. I'll remember. I'll tell them. I promise. And this time it was a promise I could keep. The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre is real. Between May 31st and June 1st, 1921, a white mob attacked the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, destroying what was known as Black Wall Street, one of the wealthiest black communities in America. An estimated 300 people were killed, 10,000 were left homeless, and 35 blocks were destroyed. For decades, this history was suppressed, excluded from textbooks and denied by officials. Survivors and descendants fought for recognition and justice for over 100 years. Mass graves are still being discovered and investigated. While Rose and her journal are fictional, the events she documents and the conspiracy to hide them are based on historical fact. The fight for acknowledgement, reparations, and justice continues today.